Hello, I'm Lucy Ciliax, and we are going to talk about how to identify African, Asian, and South Pacific art today. We're talking about this so that you, as museum curators, can understand a little better how to identify these types of art so you can include them in your museum. So, first we're going to talk a little about African art. African art is really, when we talk about what we think of as traditional African art, sub-Saharan African art. And this means the region of Africa that is south of the Sahara. This still encompasses a huge variety of countries, and there's a lot of diversity even within this region. So it's a little hard to lump all of this art together, but there are a few things that sort of bring it together and that it has in common. One thing we should talk about are the materials used in this kind of art. There are a lot of organic materials used in this kind of art, and that's because there was not a great deal of trade to this region of Africa until recently. And you're going to see maybe wood, grass, hair, and leather, these sorts of materials. Later on, you'll begin to see brass and gold after there's a little bit more of an outside influence in this region. Another thing to remember is that this part of the world, many portions of it are relatively arid, and there may not be a great deal of resources available, so people had to be pretty creative with the materials they had. You'll see human hair on some pieces and just things that may be a little more unconventional to people from Western culture. So we're also going to talk about the context for this art. Many of these pieces have kind of a religious context. They may be used in religious ceremonies and dances. You'll see masks, offerings, and you'll see sacrificial bowls, these kinds of things. There's also a political element because much of this art was used to maybe adorn the leader of a group and to show his or her status. Historically, this art may be sort of used as a record to show tribal conflicts, just different things happening in this part of the world, especially in tribes that maybe didn't have written communication. They maybe would use this art to sort of show the climate at the time, the social climate or the political climate. So talking about visual motifs, you're going to see a lot of human forms in this type of art, but they will almost always be stylized. This means they may have sort of geometric looking faces, cylindrical arms and legs, exaggerated, almost like a caricature at points, and there's a tendency towards 3D forms. You're unlikely to see a lot of paintings or that sort of art from this region, and that's just because they didn't have the resources to create those kinds of things. There's also going to be an affinity for pieces that would be used in some way, so used in a ceremony or maybe used in everyday life. Here's some examples of different art that might be characteristic of sub-Saharan Africa. On the left, you see maybe a more realistic bronze figure. This would probably be later, so in the past, 1,000 years or maybe 500 years, you would see something like this, just a little bit more use of non-organic materials. On the right, you have some pretty characteristic human figures. You can see they're sort of geometric and not what you would consider realistic. There's a lot of symbolism within these figures as well, so they might be specific to the type of ceremony that they would be used in. Moving on to South Pacific art. Again, this is a region that encompasses a lot of different countries and a lot of different cultural histories, so there's going to be a lot of visual diversity here in the art as well, but we can still sort of talk about what might be characteristic of some of these regions. So first we would talk about the materials used here. This is going to vary from region to region, but it's important to remember that most of the places in this area are sort of islands, so they're pretty limited to their own resources that they might have, and that might be stone, again, natural materials, wood, grass, those sorts of things. And later on, once these islands are sort of colonized or begin being part of a trade network, you'll see an inclusion of inorganic materials like bronze, again, and metals, those sorts of things. So the context for these pieces, many of these pieces have sort of a supernatural or magical element, and that is because many of the religions in this area of the world have kind of a magical or supernatural focus. Politically, you are going to see a change in themes once these regions are colonized. You'll see less of this kind of supernatural art and more secular art. You're also going to see art used again as a way to sort of pay homage to the leader of a tribe. Maybe they'll have a little more ornamentation, or one thing really common in this region is facial tattooing. Those sorts of things might be used to distinguish a leader from the rest of the group. Historically, you're going to have a huge variety of cultural influences due to trade and colonization, specifically in regions like Indonesia, where there were many different groups that came to Indonesia and set up colonies and trade networks. So you'll see maybe a Middle Eastern influence, you'll see some Islamic influence, you'll see European influence. So there's just a really high concentration of diversity in these kinds of arts, and it's sort of neat. So for visual motifs, you're going to see a depiction again of a lot of human figures. You'll also see animal figures. This is pretty common in regions of Oceania like New Zealand and maybe some of Hawaii, kind of Polynesian regions may have a lot of that. There's a strong presence of supernatural images, as we talked about, so, depiction of magic. There are a lot of sexual themes and sexual imagery. There's a lot of things that are kind of phallic. You'll also see a lot of monoliths in this type of art, a lot of huge stone figures, so that might be another tip-off that something is from this region of the world. Again, like our African art, most of the art is useful, so it's used either in a ceremony or in everyday life. And visually, it's pretty ornate, and there's a lot of geometry involved in these kinds of arts. So here, as an example, you'll see over here the monoliths. These are just huge, huge stone figures, and no one really knows how they were created, but these are pretty characteristic of some of the regions here in South Pacific and in Oceania. Here you'll see a mask. I think this is from the native people of maybe New Zealand, and they do a lot of geometric facial designs, either like face paint or tattooing with dots and different really geometric designs. So that's a tip-off as well. At the bottom you'll see some shadow puppets, and those are from Indonesia. You can kind of see, even just with the shapes, that there may be a little bit of like an Islamic influence or a Middle Eastern influence, which is really fascinating. You'll also notice if you watch one of these plays, you'll see that kind of supernatural influence. There's almost always some magic that happens in these plays, so that could be a tip-off as well if you know what the art was used for and what kind of performance it was used for. Moving on to Asian art, Asian art's a little bit different. Again, it encompasses a lot of different regions. We're talking about China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, just a lot of different places. Asian art is pretty groundbreaking because they used a lot of technologies in Asia that weren't used in other parts of the world for a much longer time. And a lot of this is due to the materials they had. They had ideal soil for creating clay, and they also had soil that was ideal for creating porcelain, which is a very fine clay. So this was happening really before anywhere else in the world, and they're still renowned as having really high quality pottery in Asia, China, Japan, those regions. So you'll also see some textile art, the incorporation of silk, embroidery, and this is going to be a tip-off that things are from maybe Asia also. You'll see the use of inorganic materials like bronze. You'll see the use of precious materials like jade. You'll see some woodblock prints in Japan. That's sort of a unique technology that was used. You'll also see the use of a lot of two-dimensional materials and paper specifically, and ink, and calligraphy, which is something that doesn't really occur anywhere else in the world. Talking about the context for this art, religiously there's some diversity there. It may be made to honor Buddha, it may be Confucius, It may be Islamic in nature, so it's hard to say that it would be one or the other. Politically, in Asia, the primary purpose of art for a long time was to exalt sort of the emperor and show the power of the regime at the time. So there's just a big, I guess, emphasis put on things being kind of grandiose and being very fine and just showing kind of the caliber of this government. And historically, there's an interesting historical context for a lot of Asian art because of the silk trade, and this art really sort of becomes a commodity, and there's sort of a thriving market for it in different parts of the world. And also there are many tools and many things brought from other parts of the world to Asia which influence their art. Of course, Japan is kind of unique in this because they're sort of isolated for a long, long while. They don't really have a lot of outside influence until, maybe the 20th century even. So they're kind of unique in that. And some really unique technologies have developed in Japan to create art because of that. So for visual motifs, you're going to see a lot of natural scenes, a lot of human figures, a lot of court scenes, again, just to bring emphasis to the grandness and the specialness of kind of the court and that lifestyle. You'll see a presence of calligraphy, which you won't really see in other art, so that could be a visual motif that would tell you it was from Asia. You'll see also not exactly a supernatural element, but a belief in things like luck and fate and kind of sending out that sort of energy into the world, and so you'll see some things that speak to that. Here are some examples. You'll see on the left this print here of a wave. That's from Japan, and it is a really famous example of woodblock printing. Again, this is a technology that sort of developed in Japan because of its kind of isolation, and it didn't really catch on anywhere else because people didn't really know about it. But you'll see just some extraordinary, really unique works of art that were created in that manner. On the right, you will see an example of some embroidery. This, I believe, is Korean. You'll see those natural scenes again, so like trees, the ocean, those are pretty common themes. And on the bottom, you'll see that Chinese teapot. You can really see the level of detail and craftsmanship that they're able to achieve with the resources they have, so that's pretty characteristic of this region as well. All right, I hope that was helpful to you. Here's some resources that I use that you can check out if you want to get more information. Maybe some of these tips will be helpful for you to learn to identify these different types of art, and I appreciate you listening. Please contact me if you have any questions at all, and have a great day.